there are people, many of us actually, who are lighthouses and don't even know we're being lighthouses. So a lighthouse is not necessarily not something you ask yourself. You say, well, I want to be that. I would suggest that maybe you already are that, because the lighthouse never knows who's watching it. The lighthouse never knows who draws strength from their example, from their conviction, who draws strength from. The lighthouse never knows who sees it.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Word Made Digital podcast. Thanks for checking out the video version of the podcast here on YouTube. Of course, we've got the audio version as well if you want to check that out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But we really hope that these conversations week after week inspire you, connect with you, maybe stir something up in you or teach you something that you haven't heard before. We've got a whole archive of podcasts right here on the YouTube channel, as well as a ton of tutorials to equip you really practically as a communicator, as a leader in the church, and as a creative. So I encourage you to check that out. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to the sponsors, Compassion Canada and the Church Co, for making this season of the podcast possible. Steve Pemberton, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really honored to have you today after hearing a little bit about your story. I cannot wait for other people to hear it. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, too kind, Joanna. So good to be with you. I have been equally excited to join you for this conversation.
I mean, we're going to center the conversation around your story because it's profound. I mean, that's really what you go around, I think, the most probably being asked about is we'd love to hear a little bit about your own story. And we're going to dive into, you as you've gone from this idea of from foster care to Fortune 500 exec. There's this compelling story there, but we want to talk about the lighthouse community, the lighthouse effect and the community of people around us, mentorship, how you prepare as a communicator, diversity in the workplace. We're going to try and hit up a bunch of stuff. But before we go too much farther, I really just want to pass it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit of your story? Give us some context if people don't know your story yet.
I grew up in Massachusetts in a community south of Boston called New Bedford, once the whaling capital of the world. I grew up there in foster care. I was taken from my mother when I was 3 years old, a couple of weeks before Christmas. I never saw her again. I was then moved from one foster home to another, and I never really found a permanent home or a safe place, actually. And so, it was a turbulent childhood. And you're fighting these two battles. One is just to be safe on a daily basis. And then the other is this battle over identity. I have no memory of mother or father or conception of family. And so I don't know who I look like. My birth name is Steve Klakowitz. I'd never heard of a Klakowitz before, didn't know its ethnicity. I didn't know what I was, and nobody would tell me. And so those battles every day, you're immersed in the middle of them. And, the only question on each day is going to be the height of the battle. And that's how it was, actually, even all the way through college, fighting one of those two battles, Joanna.
And, foster care for you, maybe it was a mixed experience. It was a mixed bag, maybe. Were you moving around a ton between homes? Were you in one or two homes your whole childhood? What was that environment like?
Well, early on, there were so many different homes that I could not keep track of them. And certainly my case file doesn't tell you that number. I was in one particular home for over 11 years. And that was a very, very difficult place to be. The foster family lived in a world of guile and deceit. They were violent people. And that combination of being violent and deceitful was why I stayed there as long as I did, because they managed to outsmart everybody around me, teachers, doctors, nurses, I mean, people for whom that was their job. And so the reality of being up against that every single day is quite a battle.
Yeah.
But I'd tell you that fortunately, though, I had some moments and interactions with people who unknowingly were really impacting my life, most times unaware that they were doing so. And those interactions gave me the strength to just fight one more day.
Yeah, I mean, in some of my reading and listening to the parts of your story, the foster care system and navigating that when there's no one honestly advocating for you. When the family you're living with who's supposed to care for you is lying at every turn about what that's like for you and what's really going on in the home.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about reading though as this sort of escape for you.
Oh,
Tell us about books in your childhood.
I don't remember exactly how I came to fall in love with reading, but I do know it was my great passion. The childhood was not normal. I didn't have play dates, and I could not play on youth sports. I just didn't do any of the things that normal kids do, or that kids normally do. And the only place that I could find release or sanctuary was in books. So I just loved the places they took me, whether it
Huh.
was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Jules Verne, or mysteries, which I particularly loved because my own identity was such a mystery. I just loved mysteries. And what I've come to understand is that when you read as much as I did and at that young of an age, it makes you a good student. It
Hmm.
makes you a good writer. And though I didn't talk a lot, I had some command with the spoken word too. But it all came back to that love of reading. The other thing that it did that was so important, it allowed for the creation of this counter narrative to the one that I had been fed, particularly by this foster family. You're worthless. You have no value. Nobody wants you. Uh,
You're in the
social work
way.
hasn't.
Yeah.
Yes, social worker hasn't been here to see you. You know, you need something on the other end of that scale. And what I had on the other end of that scale was the images of intact families and kindness and caring that came from reading. So I knew that there was another world out there. And the magic of reading transported me into those worlds. So I was, there was a great series called Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators. And I was the fourth investigator, I was I was at the dinner table with Encyclopedia Brown as he solved mysteries with his dad, who was the police chief. I was in those worlds, and nobody could touch me in those worlds. Nobody judged me in those worlds, and they were magical places. And
Hmm.
eventually, the real world and those magical worlds came together, and they still are.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to hear what the role that books played, or like the world that those books created played in your life,
Mm.
almost like some form of therapy, almost. Because I think for a lot of people, you see in a book or on a show on TV, you see a
Hmm.
family unit, and you just think that's not real. That's not my situation. That will never be my situation. That's not real. But for you, it actually was almost like a source of hope, or a source of
Hmm.
like it maybe cut through the bitterness that could have been like seeded into your lung life. You have this hardness of heart. Yeah, it didn't do that to
Absolutely
you.
true. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely true. It was like armor, is how I describe
Hmm.
it. It was this
Okay. Huh.
combination of armor and sanctuary, so peaceful, quiet, but it was also armor because all of the criticisms, all of the attacks, they just bounced off me. And those delivering those blows did not know that they were bouncing off me. So I never had these questions of whether or not I had some value in the world. because reading made me a good student. So I knew that I had some capabilities in the classroom. I was raw, but I knew that that could not be taken from me. Everything else had,
Yeah.
but you couldn't take my gift of learning away from me. And I would say that that's true for just about any of us. That you need some counter narrative, you need some sanctuary, you need some armor. You need a lighthouse, and those lighthouses in our life can provide that kind of protection. The reason we remember the people in our life that we do is because they provided that to us. They gave us this ability, this resolve beyond the storm that we found ourselves in, that was not of our doing. And so I thought that for me was so particularly important. I was too young to really understand it exactly that way. But Joanna, for others it's art, and others it's music, others it's sports. But I think when you're in the inheritor of a narrative that is not a positive one, the question is, what is going to counter that, and from whom will it come? And each of us have this opportunity and this ability to provide that counter narrative to someone.
Well, you tell the story of one of those first lighthouses in your life was a woman who gave you books. Can you tell us? Can you tell us about her and maybe point some of those lighthouses, as you would call them, the human lighthouses, out along the way of your story? I would love to hear some of those. I'd love for people to hear some of those stories.
It was the love of reading that brought the neighbor to me. Her name was Claire Levin. She saw me reading across the street from this foster home on a rock wall. It was more like a small retaining wall. And that's where I used to read. There was a large oak tree that hung over it, provided me a lot of shade in the summer. So that's where I read. And she came walking past my reading spot one day and asked me why, in essence, I was reading the same book that I had been reading the week before. I had never seen her before, but she certainly had seen me. And I replied by saying, in essence, that when I get to the end, I go back to the beginning so I can see new things. I said something like that. And she says, I see. Well, later on that night, there's a knock at the door of this foster home, and it's her. And she had in her arms a box of books, which she brought me not only that night, but for the remainder of the 11 years that I was in that home. She always brought books. Now, most times I never saw her, but I did see those boxes of books. So I knew where they had come from. And, I had certainly, had remembered her. When I left that neighborhood when I was 16 years old, I lost contact with her until I wrote my first book. And the people in my hometown read it. They continued to read it. And they went looking for her, and they found her. And they connected me to her.
Wow.
And so I went to go visit her. And in that conversation, I had the opportunity to ask her the question that had been on my mind all those years. Why? Why did you do that? Because in the hustle and bustle of one's own life, why did she stop? And not only give the gift of a box of books in a moment, but kept doing it over 11 years. Where did that come from? And her answer, I thought, was so instructive. She said, I was doing something my mother told me to do, to give from where you are with whatever you have. She was Jewish, and that what she was describing was an element of Jewish faith that is tzedakah, which is to give what you are able to give. If that's a smile, you give that. If it's a box of books, you give that. And the fact that you don't know how that gift's going to turn out is secondary. That's not why you do it. You don't do it for reward. You don't do it for recognition. It's what's asked of you and expected of you. So some 35 years later, I get to sit down with her and say, well, let me tell you what happened with the gift that you gave me. Yeah. And how that changed the arc of everything. And so, that for me was a lighthouse moment. She was, I'd say, the first, but certainly not the only, a director of a college access program was very much a lighthouse for me because she let me know that college was indeed not only possible, but expected of me.
Hmm.
And there was a man who worked for her who took me in when I was 16 years old. When I finally managed to escape that foster home 3 days after Christmas, nowhere to go. And I went to live with him for what was supposed to be the week between Christmas and New Year's, while the agency tried to find me more permanent placement. Well, they never did. I was the most difficult kind of case to place, so they never could place me.
And why was that?
And
Just for a pause for a sec, because I mean, a kid who reads books sounds like a nice, smart, quiet kid to have in your home. But what was it about you? Why was it difficult to place you in those years?
several driving factors. I've got this case file following me around that says he doesn't have a chance in the world, multiple placements, a quiet boy. I am African American. I am of light complexion, blue eyes, had a blonde afro at the time, my childhood hair color, and a Polish last name of Clackwood. So they really didn't know, to their way of
Huh.
thinking, what kind of family should he be with? Black family, white family, which is one of the most important lessons about diversity, I'd argue. Be less concerned with what someone is and try to remember who they are, which in my
Hmm.
case was just a young boy, who needed a safe place that never really came. And now, in complete and utter fairness to social workers who should be treated as first responders and are very much salt of the earth, the volume of cases is actually even greater today, Joanna, than it was then.
Hmm.
All of the consequences of a society that does not make opportunity available is upon us now. And we're seeing this every single day. Record level of family separations, record level of addiction, record levels of incarceration, all driven by this inability to attain access to some of the fundamentals of life, some of the fundamentals of American life.
Yeah, well, even think statistically, I think of a organization I work with that is trying to reach young girls, that 10 to 14-year-old girl, because they're statistically the most vulnerable coming out of foster care for human trafficking, that they don't have a sense of rootedness in a family or a community or a sense of value, and they get caught up with totally the wrong older creepy guys that end up selling them
Yes.
before they understand what has happened to them, and then they're stuck. All to say that, yeah, so that organization is trying to get to them before they get trafficked. But
Yes.
yeah, it's just
Yes.
hugely vulnerable, this cycle of crime and
Mm.
vulnerability, against children and youth coming in out of foster care. So, I mean, for you, you're coming out. You get told though at that critical age, your teenage years, that college or university, like you could go on to more education
Hmm.
of some kind. But I mean, you have no money. So how did you journey this? Was it more Lighthouses? Were there people who helped you pay for that or helped guide you? And a lot of us, our parents might help guide us in those kinds of decisions of what to do after school, after high school.
It was first the Upward Bound program, which is a college access program, and there are many of those kinds of programs all across the country. So we really should support those organizations wherever they are because education is the great antidote to poverty
Hmm.
and access to education specifically. So for me, I realize I have the academic ability, but not the financial resources to attend. Well, the man, John Sykes, who took me in when I was 16, I expressed this to him one evening. He was a bachelor living on his own. And when I told him that I didn't know how I was going to pay for college, he sends me on this mission, sends me to the guidance counselor's office and says, there's a big book of scholarships there. You should get it, bring it home, and we'll go through it and see which one you should apply for. And so uninformed was I that I asked him what scholarships were. And he said, well, it's free money in a way, he said. Not entirely free, but it's kind of like free. And so I understood that concept. And so I did as he asked. I bring home the book, and we're having dinner. And as we're going through it, I see a scholarship for left-handers. Blew me away. There's a scholarship for left-handers? Really? So I tell him,
left-handed people?
Left-handed people. Scholarship for left-handed people.
Okay, yeah, there's a scholarship for left-handers. Okay.
Yeah. Which gives you a sense of the scholarships out there for everybody, maybe, right? So when I tell him I'm going to apply for that scholarship, he says, well, you're not left-handed. And I said, I know, but by the time they figure it out, I will have learned. That was my answer.
Right.
And so he laughs at this and then asks me to give him the book, and he's going through it, and he sees a scholarship, and his eyes get really big, and he taps it. This one, that you should apply for this one. Now, as soon as I see the title, Joanna, I started arguing with him. I'm like, there's no way. There's no way I can win that scholarship. He's like, no, you absolutely should apply. And we're going back and forth over this. And I said, well, look, I'm going to get rejected because it clearly says that this is for Daughters of the American Revolution. And so I said, you do know I'm a boy, right? And finally, I just said, you know what? I'm going to apply just to prove him wrong. And my plan almost worked. So I did get rejected. And I showed him the rejection letter. And when I showed him the rejection letter, he looked at it and he said, yeah, that's not right. You're going to have to write them back. I said, and say what? He said, ask them if they're sure. So I did that too. And they were actually very nice to me. They wrote me back, and their message was something along the lines of, not only are we sure, but we're quite sure, in fact. And,
you are not a daughter of the American Revolution.
You are not a daughter of the American Revolution, and good luck with your endeavors. And don't write us anymore. So what did John know? Well, a couple of things he knew that I did not know. One, he obviously knew I was going to get rejected, right? He knew that. But what he knew that I did not know was that I was going to get accepted by a lot more. And the second thing he knew that I did not know or even understand is that the very adversity that I had encountered up to that point in my life was going to make me successful. That was his point, actually, along with the other one, which was, don't let fear of being told no stop you from realizing what has been a childhood dream for you. So what, and I remember him saying exactly like that. So what if they reject you? What do you care? What do you care? You've already had to deal with a lot worse than that. So what do you care? And I remembered that. And anytime I have experienced any kind of, setback, I think about it that way. And in fact, because of that experience with him, I would tell you that as a result, I've never failed, because the way John defined failure was never trying, either because you were afraid of being rejected, you didn't want to take the risk. That to him was failure. That to him was failure. Could you have setbacks? Yeah, of course you would have setbacks. Everybody has setbacks. And so, there's these broader life lessons, in there, in that moment, in that experience.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, and I love too what you're saying. This is another example of someone in your life who you're still quoting and referencing what he taught you this many years later. I think a lot of us want to be that kind of person, or we can think of maybe a few of those people in our own life. But I think too, I think of the barriers to get there, like the woman who saw you and gave you books, the guy who welcomed you as a bachelor into his home, there's lots of reasons why you would say no to having this kid in your home. There's lots of,
Mm,
you know, it just totally uprooted his bachelor pad, or I don't know what the
mhm.
exact situation is for his, you
Yeah,
know, his life. But
yeah, yeah.
this woman, you might be viewed even as like kind of creepy or intrusive if you're the woman coming and talking to a kid on the street and bringing
Hmm.
books. Like I think
Hmm.
societally there's social barriers, I think, to some of these opportunities.
Mm,
You know, what would you
mm,
say to people about that? Like, how do you get over some of that? Because you see a need, you think, am I the one to
mm,
do something about it? But there's all
mm,
these reasons, you know, whether
mm.
personally or just culturally, that would be like, nah, don't get involved.
Think back to our own experience. Any of us, whether we're hosting a podcast or in the business world as I am and an author, you look back and refer back to your own experiences and think about the people and the paths that those people created for you to enjoy your life as it is today.
Mm.
And you're likely to think of that elementary school teacher, that high school coach or counselor, a first boss, a kind neighbor. You're likely to remember who your lighthouse was, and you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. And if indeed you do know who that is, and I would suggest that you do, then there is this implication. I'll say something greater than an implication. There's an obligation for you to be that to somebody else.
Mm.
You owe, in other words, you owe. Now, that person could have been mom or dad too, but that was Claire Levin's point. That was what her mother told her. You owe, in essence. You owe. And I think the other barrier is that we have wrongly concluded or assumed that to be a human lighthouse in somebody's life means I have to be wealthy. I have to have this enormous platform that people will read what I say and will be influenced and impacted. So I have to be this enormous being in the world in order to have an impact. I think that is a perception of the barrier. However, go back to your own experience. Were the people who most impacted your life, were they those kinds of people? Did they have massive Twitter followings?
Yeah.
Were they on the nightly news? Were they very wealthy? I would venture to say that they're probably not, or were not. The lighthouses in my life were not. And the other point I would make is that there are people, many of us actually, who are lighthouses and don't even know we're being lighthouses. So a lighthouse is not necessarily not something you ask yourself. You say, "Well, I want to be that." I would suggest that maybe you already are that,
Hmm.
because the lighthouse never knows who's watching it. The lighthouse never knows who draws strength from their example, from their conviction, who draws strength from the lighthouse. Never knows who sees it, and so this idea, which is also a barrier, is that I need to be able to see the return on what I do. But that's not the essence of faith, right? Faith says the opposite of that, that you need not see the outcome to know that you're having an impact. It's not necessary. Because, and if that's how you're thinking, then that, at least biblically and spiritually, violates the covenant, right? Which is the left hand ought not to know what the right hand is doing when it comes to giving. And so the last point I would make is that we also are witnessing what happens to the character and the culture of a society when people avoid that obligation and step away from it and say, well, that's not my responsibility to go bring him books, or, well, what kind of impact could I ever have? Well, this is no accident that what we talked about earlier, the number of family separations and levels of addiction that we're seeing, because people have lost hope. And they're also looking for hope in the wrong places and to the wrong people rather than the everyday people that are all around us. So I would say, lastly, for anybody who would say, well, who am I to be a lighthouse. That's the wrong question. The real question is, who are you not to?
Yeah. Well, and I even just think in the faith community, the statistics of like if every church in America took in like not family, but every church, so a family in the church
Mm-hmm.
took like one kid into their care from the foster system, or a need for foster to adopt or whatever it is. Basically, the entire crisis of foster care in America would go away if like
Mm,
one family in every church did their part. Meaning it's not every family in the church, even just one
just
family in
one.
the church.
No.
I mean, that's how simple it is. And I know how many barriers we put on it, but how simple, like,
Yeah.
this is a problem that can be solved by people who say they have a faith system that, that points them to caring for the least of
Mm.
these.
And and a and a scripture that mentions the word orphan 27 times. 27 times. The word orphan is mentioned in the Bible and across multiple books and in very specific ways about the obligation and responsibility that we have to the orphan. The judgment when you were not a protector. Scripture mentions strength of the fatherless. I mean, think about that as a phrase for a moment. Strength of the fatherless, and referring to the orphan. That there is this strength, there is this ability that one develops and has as a result of being orphaned. It is also no accident that in children's literature, the archetype that is the orphan is all around us. Batman was orphaned. Superman was orphaned. There's little orphan Andy.
Yeah.
There's even
Well,
Kevin
Canadian. I'm in
McAllister.
Canada, so Anne of Green Gables is the
Yes,
Canadian orphan story. Yeah.
and isn't that fascinating, Joanna? Right, that we don't, and until you start listing all of the individuals have been orphaned, you realize that there's this much broader narrative about the orphan specifically. And even in America, the most popular holiday movie probably of all time, Home Alone, is about a young boy who was, albeit temporarily, orphaned. And
Yeah.
and so there's this
Abandoned at
deeper,
Christmas. Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. So to me, it's actually, Scripture is very clear about what our faith obligation is to the orphan. To your point about one family in a church, I mean, there's nothing on the other side of that ledger that says that's going to balance that out. I don't think there's anything that can that message cannot be denied. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. I mean, and the other piece you're talking about, the obligation of Christian communities, church communities, or organizations of large groups of Christian people, whether that's, a charity or whatever. This the broad category of multiculturalism. Like, you're talking about being the kid who couldn't find a home because they wanted to place you with people that were like you, quote unquote, but they didn't know where that even was. And now you work in multiculturalism in like large corporate America.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So, I mean, there's, you would spend many, many hours and you spend a career working on this topic. So we can't cover
Mm-hmm.
it in 10 minutes. But,
Mm-hmm.
but what are some markers of, I guess, moving from a tokenism to a real inclusion of people who are different than us? Particularly when I think of this, I'm addressing faith leaders, church leaders, people
Mm-hmm.
who have choices like me. People who have choices of who we invite on our podcast. Who do we give voices to? I'd love your insight, and I'd love your critique too, because we're not doing it well.
No, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any society that's doing it well, and the consequences of not doing it well are all around us. The inability to embrace what is God's gift to us, which is diversity. I mean, man can claim a lot of things. Um, he cannot claim to be a creator of life, and he cannot claim to be a creator of diversity. That's God's doing. So I start always from that fundamental premise. And to recognize and realize that there is this um, duality of difference and commonality that exists in every single human being that you meet is, to me, the pathway through it all. And I was trying to make this point very specifically in the book about how the lighthouse in and of itself is quite literally a framework for how to navigate and manage conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion. Because the lighthouse is there in a harbor or sitting on a cliff, and it is really trying to steer you away from difficulty. So lighthouse doesn't say come this way. It says don't come this way. That way is the better, safer way for you to go.
Right.
But when it's doing that, it doesn't ask, well, what's your race? What's your gender? Are you an indigenous people or not? Who'd you vote for in the last election? Lighthouse not concerned about any of that. All it sees really is your humanity. And because it does, it says that you're worthy and that you have value, and that my role in this moment as a lighthouse is to protect your humanity by guiding you towards safe harbor. If us as human beings acted and behaved in that way, so the lighthouse does not qualify your distress, nor does it render judgment on the fact that you're uncertain or in a storm. It doesn't ask you any of those things. If we as people behave that same way, I'm not going to concern myself with whether you're disabled or part of the LGBTQ community. I'm going to see your humanity first, which we know is God's gift. Then so much of what we see around us would dissipate, much like your earlier example of each one family in a church adopted a child. Well, you would see the same kind of thing. What you have to get away from is, this idea that all different experiences can be boiled down into one single thing. I just don't think that's possible. I know on my teams, I always want to have different perspectives around me. If you navigate the world as a woman, you navigate it differently than I do. If you navigate the world with a disability, you navigate it differently than I do. And therefore, that means I have something I can learn from you. And that, I think, then has such a big impact on the products that we create, the way that we market, the constituencies and the customers we talk to and how we talk to them. I'll be honest, I can't tell you the number of times that a woman's perspective has saved me from embarrassment. I can't even count. But you know what I did? It taught me to learn. It taught me to always ask for that particular perspective. And it makes me, I think it makes me informed, actually, and wiser to ask somebody of a different life experience than me to weigh in on things. The last thing I would say is that don't disqualify ourselves, which I see a fair amount. Well, I'm not a diverse person. I'm not an indigenous person. And so what would I know about diversity? To which
Like
my answer is...
if I'm a white guy, I feel like I'm not allowed to talk about this issue.
Right. And what I hear is avoidance and deflection. And when in fact, you're as qualified to speak about diversity as anybody else. And why is that? Well, because you understand fairness, you understand equity, you understand the importance of inclusion, because that's how you have to navigate the world too. So this idea that diversity is beyond you is not borne out in any kind of fact. And most, even, and most white men can point to an experience or two where they felt othered, where they felt that they were in the minority. I had a good friend of mine one time, we were at a social event, and kind of leaned over to me and he said, I wonder what he goes, I'm sitting here thinking about how you must feel being the only person of color in this room. Just recognizing that for a moment. But when I asked him later, he said, well, I was also thinking about the time that I was playing college basketball, and I was the only white guy in the gym, right? And he goes, I remember how that felt, you know? But he also was very quick to point out that he had never been more welcomed and supported, because it's also true of diverse people in our own communities are always naturally inclusive, because we know what it's like to be othered. So our
Right.
initial tendency is to be welcoming, actually. It is not to disconnect you and not say you don't belong here.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. It's again turning like we went back to in the earlier part of the conversation, like coming from a really negative, even violent background, whether emotionally violent, physically violent, intellectually, like a really dark place, and that you found this light in books, and saying that people who have experienced being othered can actually be quite welcoming and hospitable to other people because they knew what it felt like and they don't want to do that to other people. The
Yes.
this is I mean, as I said, a conversation we could have much longer if we had the time. But the place I want to get to last in our conversation today is around communication, because obviously, as people can hear you or listening to you, you're a communicator. You do this all the time. You've done.
Mm-hmm.
I even think I watched a TED talk of yours. So a lot of people listening are communicators, whether full time or it's a part of
Mm-hmm.
their work. Give us a little bit of inside scoop on how do you prepare for these talks?
Ah,
What is some of your advice to other communicators listening on how to be a better communicator or how to prepare before you give a talk?
it is certainly a combination of art and science. The science part to me is the framework of message and your hierarchy of message. What is the single most important thing that you want to convey? What is that? And you have to write that down before you even get into the speech or anything like that. What is the single most important message, that you want to convey, or messages? And you stack rank them. Um, and then one of my, I don't know if it's a secret or not, uh, but I'm always trying to provide you with a framework, a metaphor, something that you'll walk away with, because you won't necessarily remember the advice of one, two, three, or four, but you're more inclined to remember the framework, right? So, um, the lighthouse effect. I called it. I called my latest book that, for a very specific reason, because we all know what a lighthouse is. And 3 weeks later, you might go, I don't remember everything, but I remember the
Yeah.
lighthouse. And
Yeah.
what's
The
more, you might see a
huge
lighthouse.
visual metaphor. Yeah.
Absolutely. So visual metaphors as a way of making a point. And oftentimes I see the opposite happen, where we want to dispense the advice, and then, the metaphor comes on a bit later. And then I think it's got to be this avenue of flexibility, almost in message. So one of the things when I'm speaking, I am very purposeful about this. I am always trying to allow for, even at the last minute, something to impact me that I can now I can pivot off of. And I'll give you a couple examples of this. On Sunday, I delivered the commencement address for a class of 2020 at my alma mater, Boston College. And I was talking, in essence, to them. I only had like 8 to 12 minutes or so. I had to give them a visual metaphor, right? I had to do that. And but in that allowance for something um, that would stick with you. And I'm thinking about this. So I talked to the organizers, and I said, okay, because they had mass first and they had commencement. So I said to the organizers, I said, well, how much time is there between the end of the mass and the start of commencements? They said 15 minutes. I said, okay, so I'm going to walk out amongst the graduates. I want to spend some time talking. I want to spend 15 minutes talking to them. And that's what I did. And I made what they told me part of my remarks 15 minutes later.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
and one of them was of this young woman. Her name is Hina. There were five girls. They were all taking a picture. They were representing their individual schools. And so they wanted me to take a picture. As a commencement speaker, I did. And I said, okay, I asked all five of them, it was I'm like, so who's here to see you graduate? And Hina says, there's nobody here to see me graduate. My mother and father are in Madagascar. They couldn't travel. And so, but then she says, I'm a nurse. And so I have invited one of my clients here. And so as soon as I heard that, automatically, Joanne, I'm thinking I'm going to make that part of my remarks as a way of making a point. And my point was, uh, and I told this in less than 15 seconds, and I said that Hina's parents could not make it. She's a nurse on the front lines of a pandemic. She's joined by her client today, and they're joining Hina to celebrate this day. They are reminding all of us that family is not just what you're born into, it's also who you find along the way. So you can see in
Right.
15 seconds, right, there's a tightness of
Yeah.
communication, visual metaphor, example, and lesson all happening at the exact same time. Second one, real quick, I'll tell you, I was interviewing Michelle Obama back in 2017, I believe this was, and spent a lot of time preparing. And one of the ways I did that, I looked at other interviews she had done, and two things jumped out at me. One, most of the conversation was about her husband. My wife loves me. She doesn't want to spend all day talking about me all the time. I don't care how great an individual is.
Yeah,
And
you want to talk about yourself, not your famous partner. Yeah.
exactly right. Exactly right. And then on top of that, her famous partner would be the first one to tell you that he wouldn't be who he was if it weren't for her. So there was, I was like, that's something's off there. So now what did I say? I said, I'm going to ask her one question about him. That's it. One question. That's all I did. One question. The other thing I picked up on was not just in interviews, but she always went to a different place when you asked her about children. And I was always amazed at the interviewers who never picked
Hmm.
up on that.
Right.
And
Like there
that's
was,
and
she was resonating with it, and there was more they could have pulled off of that more.
but
Yeah.
what did they do? They wanted to go back to the celebrity. They wanted to go back to him. And I thought, no, her power is in her love of children. And what you know is amazing is that as I was asking her that, I could see her begin to get emotional because we were 5 feet away from each other, and I could see her begin. I could tell once she was grateful that I had even asked that or had seen that, and then it just gave her an opportunity to really talk about how important she thought children, really were. So a lot of preparation goes into it, a lot of homework. But I do think having a hierarchy of message, a visual metaphor, and examples that people will walk away with are so instructive, so powerful. Lastly, I mean, and I do get into, I mean, I do use intonation and inflection and pauses. I do that in very specific ways because all of that is power. I work really hard not to say even in general conversation. So as you and I are talking right now, I am purposefully pausing in between my sentences rather than saying because what says is I don't know what I'm going to say next. I'm trying to figure it
Yes.
out. But pause. So you just pause, and you know what? Nobody's the wiser. Powerful communication tools.
Yeah. And to watch yourself and realize how many times you did it. Uh, so you need to learn some, yeah, you're right, some self control around ums and
Mm.
ah fillers. I love that. Well, Steve, there's so many nuggets that people will pull out of today, and we'll draw some of those out in the notes. But what we also want to include in the notes from the conversation is where do people find you? If you want to send people to your book, to your favorite places to hang out on the internet, where do you want to send people today?
So you can go to my website, stevepemberton.io, where everything I am up to is there. And similarly, so you can find me on social media at Steve Pemberton. That's true on LinkedIn. That's true on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram are the primary places that I am. I always encourage people to share their stories with me. I love hearing stories of other people's lives and journeys. That's what really drove the Lighthouse Effect. I wanted to tell other people's stories, and I'm working on quite a few other things as well. I do have a master class. It's going to be released in a week or so that I'm co-hosting with one of the people that I wrote about, one of the 10 lighthouses that I wrote about.
Oh,
And
cool.
so it's fascinating. And what I'm really trying to do ultimately, Joanna, is a bit of what you're doing, which is trying to create platforms for us to connect and find our more common story, and to do that through something that has at times been co-opted, and that is faith, and try to, in some small way, restore our faith in each other.
I love that. Steve, thank you so much for your time today. I think people are seeing and listening when they hear there is so much more to you than meets the eye. Just, I mean, even in one story, there's a whole book worth of stories, even just some of the examples you've given. So thank you so much for your time today. I do want people to go find the Lighthouse Effect and all these resources you mentioned. I am now very curious about this masterclass that's coming out. So we're gonna link to that as well in the show notes, because it'll be out, I think, by the time this releases in a couple weeks. So thanks so much, Steve.
Thanks, Joanna. Love being with you.